Roman Holiday, Day 2. Hello, I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter, author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. This is a nice, organic peanut butter that slides around. Apparently it's healthier, it's not hydrogenated, so keep your doctor happy. Good on carrot sticks. So we are finishing up. Don't fall over. I just had the carpet cleaned. I don't want to make a mess. So we're finishing up the book of Romans, and I'm going to do a little shift. Instead of doing an expository where I go chapter by chapter, I'm going to do this thematically. So, sorry, get the lights reflecting in my eyes a little bit. So it looks like those X-ray vision eyes. So let me do a little bit of adjusting. Work with me here. There we go. So we're doing expository. Instead of going expository, I'm going to take this thematically. So this is the longest epistle, and it's a lot to take in. So it may be helpful for you to sit there and write your own chapter summaries in addition to the chapter headings as you read it, just to teach yourself from what you're reading. It's like I said, it's a little bit of a long book, and but we're studying important things here, so it's worth the investment and time to study this. So, and also another thing to keep in mind is that chapter 7 is almost entirely Joseph Smith translation. And another thing to think of is, as you're reading these books, we start going from thinking in terms of verses to thinking in terms of chapters, then sort of the books of the Bible, then the books of the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, and you start thinking of the canon as a whole, you start thinking in terms of all truth. It's an incremental process, but it's, like I said, it's worth the time investment to do this. You're going to really come away with a better understanding of the gospel. So the themes. So one of the themes is, keep in mind the audience. So he's writing to Romans. So you have members of the church that are Jewish proselytes, or Jewish converts to Christianity, or proselytes. And they also have Gentile converts. And this is always the tension that they're trying to figure out, okay, what's the relationship between the law of Moses and the law of the gospel? Do you have to become a Jew first before you become a Christian? We think that's funny, but it was a big issue back then. And apparently the Nephites didn't have any problem, but then again, they may have been a little bit more isolated, but not as isolated as we think they are. And of course, the other question, too, is the nature of assimilation, where you start adopting the outside culture, which is a problem nowadays, where you start show up to church and people are just teaching worldly philosophies instead of the gospel. And how do you know the difference? Just study the scriptures, and that'll set you straight. So the audience is Jewish converts, Gentile converts, and the assimilation problem. Next thing to think about is the justification. So are you justified by obedience to the law of Moses, or are you justified by obeying the law of the gospel? And this gets talked about in the Book of Mormon in 2 Nephi 2, is where Lehi says, you're not saved by the temporal law, and you're not saved by the spiritual law, that you need Christ. And there, Abinadi talks about that too in his sermon, that you just can't obey your way into heaven, that you need Christ in there. And then you have to understand the place of obedience in the context of the atonement, the third article of faith. Another thing to think of is that justification is part of the atonement. It's not the entire effect of what the atonement has upon us. Part of it's justification, part of it's sanctification, part of it's deification. And so we're focusing on a little part of it. And that's kind of like what throws us off as we dialogue with people who are evangelicals. So are you justified by grace, faith, or works? And you can't behave your way into the celestial kingdom. Part of it because you cannot behave your way into a resurrection. You just cannot resurrect yourself. That's talked about in Alma chapter 11, verses 43 to 45. You also have the human nature problem. You think about this at work. When you go to work or in church, how many of your problems are human nature problems? Not behavior problems, not character problems, but human nature problems. Human nature is covered in Alma 41. And you have the problem that we're incomplete. We're in the process of developing. That's talked about in Alma 12:13. And so the obedience helps with this incompleteness as we develop character attributes, but you still just can't behave your way into the celestial kingdom by your own efforts. You still need Christ and the grace of God to bless you. And think about this: if we're saved by grace, what's the place of obedience? And that's a big hang-up we have when we talk with evangelicals or with Protestants. This tension, and you really need to think about what's going on, because you're saved by grace, but you're judged by your works. And you're also developed by the way when you keep the commandments. That's also a form of development, which you just don't get. And so justification doesn't cover that development process, and it's true, but it's incomplete. True, but incomplete. Now, another thing that, 5 minutes. Another thing that Paul talks about is adoption. So that's one thing, is where you start ingrafting proselytes, people who aren't members of the church, who join the church. That's an adoption process. You get there with patriarchal blessings, where it says that you're adopted into this tribe, or that you're just naturally born into a tribe of Israel. But you also have this sometimes confusing principle that we're naturally children of Heavenly Father, but when we start obeying the gospel and we get baptized, we become God's children, that in that sense. So the First Presidency issued a statement about it a couple of years ago. I think it was 100 years ago, on the Father and Son to Doctrinal Exposition. So adoption refers to that aspect too, is when, even if you're born in the covenant, you're still adopted into the family of God. Now, another thing to talk about is joint heirship, and that's covered in chapter 8. And this is it in a nutshell. Jesus Christ, since he's the Son of God, is God's heir. So in the name of the will, Christ inherits everything from God, inherits all of God's estate. However, when we enter the covenant path, as President Nelson has talked about, we make these covenants and we obey. We also become co-heirs or joint heirs with Jesus Christ. That is, we have claim to the same as God's estate that Jesus Christ does. And it's just another way of talking about exaltation. It's describing exaltation in terms of an inheritance. So because of Christ's atonement, we're on the same standing with Christ as we had before God as Christ is. And so we have the same inheritance that Christ has. So yeah, it may take some study about that to understand that. Another thing to think about is with election, ordination, and being chosen. That's covered in chapters 9 and 11. And I think we can understand that as we use the term foreordination, we don't use predestination, because there's some confusion there, although predestination does come up in the Joseph Smith translation. We don't talk a lot about election or being, sometimes we talk about chosen, person who's being called and chosen. Many are called, but few are chosen. But they're all talking about the same principle, that you're foreordained to do something. The word election, it comes from a Greek word that means to be chosen. It's related to the words ecclesiastic, eclectic, and also just election, in the sense we use it in the United States of America, where you're voting for someone. So not a difficult concept. We're just using words that we don't normally talk about in the church. They're not in the Book of Mormon as robustly as they are, and we just don't normally teach from them. But it's all part of the gospel, and Paul's just explaining it in a different way. Plus, we sometimes have the baggage that we get from traditional Christianity, from Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox religion, and also with Protestantism, how they use it. It affects our understanding, and so we sometimes understand it in an incorrect way. So chapter 10 talks about teaching the gospel. In chapter 13, it discusses partially a little bit about the relationship between members and church leaders. So when you read 13 verse 1, people understand it as a church and state thing, honoring the powers that be. That's a good principle, but the Joseph Smith translation makes a correction, and it just refers to the leaders within the church and respecting their office. And respecting a leader's office starts when the leader respecting his own office. So when a leader's in there, they're not exercising unrighteous dominion. They're not just tweaking things around, altering the church, but they're actually being true to their office, and it makes it a lot easier for members to be true to their office. Not a lot about backbiting church leaders. Another thing, too, is discipleship. That's also covered in the rest of chapter 13. So that covers most of what Paul had to say in these latter chapters. There's a lot of them. The terminology may not be familiar. It's in King James English, so it gets a little bit confusing. In Roman is funny because the way the book concludes is that, it talks about going to Spain, and Rome was in Spain. It was called Hispania. They're on the Iberian Peninsula. In fact, Julius Caesar was in Spain. He also went to Portugal. In Plutarch's Lives, They talked about going to Lusitania, and Lusitania is the name of the Roman province. I mean, I assume that was the Celtic name for the indigenous people of Portugal. But yeah, the Romans were in that area, so they had the legal system, the military system, but also the great Roman roads, which help with the spreading of the gospel. So Paul had a large vision. Yeah, he's in Rome, and he was thinking about going to Spain. There you go. That's kind of an interesting thing. Another thing, too, is when Paul concludes his epistle, he lists a bunch of names. And it's interesting to read the names. If you're up to speed on where the names come from, the Greek names, the Roman names, the Hebrew names. Now, here's a trick thing. There's a pair of twins mentioned in the list of names. See if you can find it. And also, we know the name of the person who is Paul's scribe. He's mentioned in this long list of names. And then lastly, Paul tried to end this letter 3 times. So at the end of chapter 15, he stops, but then there's an extra chapter. In verse 24, Paul stops there. And he manages to crank out a few more verses in verse 27 where it actually ends. So he just kind of keeps going. It's a little bit like with Moroni. I thought I was going to die, so here's some more information. I'm still alive, so let me add this more information in here. So that's fun. Sort of when you get familiar with the text, you start noticing these types of things. So as you read and reread the book of Paul and paying attention to the Joseph Smith translation, it becomes very easy and becomes a familiar text to you, as much as the passages are in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Enos is how that's very familiar to us. Romans can become that familiar with you as you study it. So the Christ quotient. So the main message of the Book of Romans is in part about how the atonement works, and Paul's focusing on the part we call justification. He doesn't spend time talking about sanctification or deification, just this one part. So it's incomplete. So it's part but incomplete, and that's where this confusion comes from when we dialogue with evangelicals. They'll focus on justification, not so much sanctification or deification. Whereas when you go to Eastern Orthodoxy, they're just, boom, jump right into they go to justification. They talk about sanctification and deification aspect of Christianity. So yeah, you want some fun, read up on Eastern Orthodox religion. There's a book called Eastern Orthodoxy I believe it's by Timothy Weir, which gives you a good introduction to it. And like I said, this is a barrier when we dialogue with evangelicals, is that, yeah, justification's true, but there's more stuff going on here with being saved. This also highlights a problem where you have if your understanding of the Bible is a Bible first and Bible only approach to doctrine, you're missing stuff. There's other things in the Book of Mormon and the rest in the Doctrine and Covenants which round out our understanding of what Paul's talking about. Definitely the Joseph Smith translation. Like I said, chapter 7, that has substantial, the entire chapter is almost the Joseph Smith translation revision. Another thing, too, the list of the names. Are we remembering names? Do we know the names of our ancestors? Do we know the names of our ministering families? Are we praying for our ministering families? Just get your phone out, open up the app. You can check the names. It's updated real time. Are you learning the names of people, including if you live in a high turnover ward? Dale Carnegie said, a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. I had a funny instance. I was traveling on an airplane, so when the flight attendants would come to me, I'd read their name tag and call them by name. So this one guy called him by name, and he's like, how'd you know my name? It's like, it's on your name tag. But it works when you're remembering people's names. It takes some effort, but it's a good investment of time. And also think about, too, in the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, when they talk about record keeping, numbering the people and keeping track of people. That's one of the hardest things in high turnover ward is people coming in and out, and sometimes people hiding or wanting to take a vacation when they show up to church, and people, you're trying to reach out to them and they're throwing sand in your face, but, turn the other cheek. So that's enough about names. And lastly, I'd like to talk about this, and this is in the context where you show up to church, you make this covenant with the sacrament, then you shuffle into Sunday school or quorum or relief society, you begin the class with a prayer. People haven't read the lesson beforehand, and while the lesson is being taught, they're on their cell phone checking social media or playing video games. And so you have that barrier. And the other thing, too, is what do you do when a passage of Scripture is difficult? what we do is we do this rut of not reading, and that's a form of denial and avoidance tactics. So denial and avoidance tactic. The other one is going through the motion, where you're just not doing it with real intent. You have the agonizing aspect, the pity party. There's an approach where you just freeload off a podcast. Or the better approach is to slowly work up to it, line upon line, precept upon precept, and think about the small and simple things you can do to understand these difficult passages in the scriptures. Not doing it all at once. It may take 15 readings, but how long are you going to be alive? We're just going to be cycling through this every 4 years. That's going to come up. And hopefully in those 4 years, something's going to leave an impression upon you. It's going to be transformative. So you work at it, do small and simple things, line upon line. And the reason why is you need to study the scriptures. The book of Romans is not a romantic comedy. It's high theology. And you just might find it very boring. But the scriptures are there here to entertain you. This is not a puppet show. We're talking about things that are going to affect you in the afterlife. And studying the scriptures is a way to understand Christ. And understanding Christ and coming to Christ, that's the point.